Right, so now we move on to item 7. I will just briefly introduce it before we go into the presentations. So obviously we have an extraordinary meeting for this one item. It's Auckland's first, and I think New Zealand's first, transport emissions reduction pathway. Last year we unanimously in August supported the direction of this, and we did acknowledge our 64% need target to reduce transport emissions in Te Tarakia Tāwhiri, and that's what the TERP was put forward on, and we established the group, the working group on this. So I just would like to acknowledge from Auckland Transport, Adrian, Wayne and Abby, from Auckland Council, myself, Angela and Josephine. We had David and Tau from the Independent Māori Statutory Board, and Ngārimu and Martin from the Mana Whenua Katia, and the number of staff who were involved with that. So we met many times to discuss this through, I think the first few times were in lockdowns and all sorts of difficulties there, but we got through it. I'm very proud that we've got to this point, and the amount of work that has gone into it, into this very clear pathway which follows our unanimous decision in 2020 for Te Tarakia Tāwhiri, and all the goals and targets we supported through that are now embedded through the TERP, which we hope to pass today. So I'll ask, who will I ask to come forward first? Jacques, you? Adrian and Wayne. All right. Yeah. Oh yeah, right, sorry. We'll get Adrian to come forward first. Adrian's going to present on behalf of, and Abby as well, Auckland Transport, to tell us what happened at their meeting, and also just acknowledge the work that Auckland Transport has done in partnership with Auckland Council on this pathway. Kia ora, Adrian.
Kia ora, Māori ora ki te whare. Ena mana whenua, ena matawaka, tēnā koutou e te koromātua golf. E rau rangatira mā tēnā rā koutou katoa, ko Adrian Young Cooper, tōku inga. I've just got a few opening words. I know this is a day basically for the governing body and other elected officials. I had a lot of choices when I woke up today, and I want to talk briefly about just one of them. How was I going to attend this meeting in the town hall? Now, I've got the privilege of having buses and ferries, and with my AT mobile app I could figure out I needed my raincoat and the walk I should plan for to get to the bus or the ferry, and the walk at the other end and the bus, or I could take my car, which is about a couple of feet away from where I was looking through my app, or I could dial in to the meeting. I had to trade off my time, my cost, convenience, reliability, and apologies to the person from Generation Zero who was not able to get here because of reliability of a bus service, to make that choice. I also thought about, how can I optimise my carbon use for the day, for the purposes that I had for today. Well, today well over 1 million Aucklanders are making decisions that impact their carbon footprint. And hundreds of thousands of Aucklanders are actually making a choice deliberately that reduces their transport emissions by walking, biking, staying at home, sharing a ride, going later, taking an electric car if they're lucky enough to have one, busing, going by train, or going by ferry. These are just the things that we do every day, and Auckland Transport needs to make sure that we make it easier and we give Aucklanders all the tools that they need to make better choices. And I completely endorse the comments made by the Waihihi person. We've got to actually take everyone with us if we're going to accelerate the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from transport in Auckland, and that is the heart of TERP. There are really clear transformation areas that together will give us choices and tools, and we need to play our part in the global task for the good of the planet. The Auckland Transport Board did unanimously last week endorse the 11 transformation areas, and also put in place a number of other resolutions which are basically aimed at accelerating the attention we already have to the reduction of transport emissions in Auckland. It's a very clear strategy, and we think it is incredibly helpful to have a single pathway, and we've been privileged to work with Auckland Council in developing the pathway. I would just like to address a couple of things. There have been some concerns that TERP is an uncosted blueprint. I think I've already been able to identify that a huge number of the activities which will accelerate the reduction of transport emissions we are already doing. And we're already doing them by the hundreds of thousands and the millions every day. So these are not things where we're trying to act. There is not a radical change. What we're trying to do, though, is actually acknowledge Auckland's and New Zealand's global obligations to reduce transport emissions. We don't have much time, and that just means we have to go faster in our actions, and they have to be coordinated, integrated, and very, very focused. Auckland Transport, the board of Auckland Transport has asked the interim chief executive to come back to us with actually a practical, tactical plan for how we're going to evaluate all the things we are already doing. Where there is a need for focus, there is a need for us to be really sure that the things that we are doing with the funding envelopes we already have and the requirements and our accountabilities through the SOI to the council, that we're doing things in the best possible way. And some of this, of course, is that, and if we look at some of the things that we're already doing, we're already out with many of the projects and are already engaging solidly with the community. In closing, I did want to mention one aspect of the resolution of the board. Auckland Transport is committed to continuing to engage and build stronger partnerships with mana whenua as our treaty partners and kaitiaki in driving decarbonisation of Auckland. But that actually goes, of course, for the entire Auckland community. And I want to particularly acknowledge the comments that were made by the person from Waiheke about the criticality of actually working with the people of Auckland. That is deeply embedded inside TERP. Happy to answer any questions.
Kia ora. Thank you so much, Chair Adrian, and just want to acknowledge you, Wayne, and Abby, but also the Auckland Transport staff members. But you've been an integral piece of this, Adrian especially, texting and phoning and discussing this, and it has been a very interesting, tough conversation, but one that we're all definitely on the same page and direction, knowing that the task is huge, but we have to do this. We've all signed up for this, and that you're willing and up for the task. So thank you very much, and acknowledge Wayne, hopefully listening online. He sent me a message, but I haven't had time to get back to him. He's been really a huge supporter and very, very strong on this as well. So acknowledge you all. I've got 3 questions so far. First of all, Deputy Chair, Councillor Coon.
Thank you, Chair. Tēnā koe, Adrian, and thank you so much for your leadership. And ngā mihi nui kia koutou to all the Abby and Wayne and yourself on the TUG, and seeing this through to completion and the decision of the board. It's really great to have you here and providing your comments. So thank you so much. This is something, there's often been a comment that this is just too difficult, and there's just no way we can get there. And that's maybe a belief that is part of the culture of all of our organisations or the Auckland Council whānau, that this is just too unachievable, so we might as well just keep doing business as usual. And I have heard that Wayne made some fantastic comments in response to that, if I'm allowed to know that, because I think it was shared with all the board members. And I just wonder if Wayne can't talk to that. Maybe you could just share with us that kind of what you're thinking as a leadership in terms of getting the whole organisation focused on the goal that we've all set ourselves and putting ourselves on this pathway to ensure that it is achievable. Kia ora.
Well, I will pass over to Wayne in a moment, but quite in a very straightforward way. He said, if not now, when? Okay, so just simply, there is acknowledgement right through the Auckland community, and here, that essentially we have got a very, very big task to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and if we don't actually really focus on it now, then when? We know that things are not getting any better. So it was. There's never a good time to. Well, actually, there is a good time. Today's today. But there are real challenges in basically setting the ambitious targets, which are embedded in TERP. But at least they have actually put into a really good context what te turukia tawhiri means practically, and we think that we all deserve to hear the truth. So I'd like to just pass over to Wayne for a moment.
Kia ora, everybody. Thanks, Adrian. I don't think I can add a lot to that. I think it was really important that once we'd been through the TERP process, that the AT board sort of stepped back from that process and thought about this from a leadership perspective, and that's really what the message that Adrian, Abby and I put to the board was, yes, if we don't, if not now, when? And if Auckland Transport Board were in any way half-hearted about this, we would stall the process. And it was really important to get behind this. I think I used the language that, you know, without being overly dramatic, how the AT board dealt with TERP was probably the nuclear moment of our administration. And if we didn't set the tone and set the direction, then this endeavour would slow down because of that. And it was really pleasing that the whole board got behind it.
Kia ora, thank you, Deputy Chair Wayne. Now, I've got 4 more questions, 5, and I might cut it off there because we need to keep it focused just with Auckland Transport, what Adrian's presented, because there is a big presentation from staff after this with a lot more detail on the TERP and things like that. So just from Adrian's perspective, the questions focus, please. Councillor Cooper.
Thank you, Adrian. I guess for me is your board are going to be tasked with really doing this work, and apart from setting this, the end of the day, even with the RLTP, we don't get a lot of say as elected members who do represent Aucklanders. And I guess for me, you know, I got an email yesterday from a gentleman who lives in Te Aratū South. He's desperate to use public transport, and he does. 3.7k drive to a park and ride, train to Newmarket, train to Ellerslie, 2 kilometre walk to Penrose. And as he said, he can never get a bus from the train. He's walking with, you know, and weather like this, it's an hour and a half for him to get to work each way. And his family, his boss is getting really annoyed with him, and he's just about ready going to lose his job. And so I guess for me, we've got big picture, but are we really looking at much better bespoke? Because every time I ask, we go, look, this is the bigger picture, we're doing this. And we've had so many cuts to bus services, especially our express ones. How is Auckland Transport going to really meet these targets and make it a pleasant and efficient way to get to work by not using their car?
We need to carry on doing what we're doing better, with an absolute focus, as we already have, on our customer and the customer journey. It is absolutely critical that we start, and I think that's a very good example. I actually found the young girl who I think is a future intern for the Auckland Transport Board on the experience of walking Every single one of these journeys needs to be made easier and needs to be safer and needs to be more accessible. This is what we're trying to do every day, day in, day out, and we have got a very big job still to do. I can only acknowledge what you're saying, Councillor Cooper, but I just want to go back to the initial comment you made. TERP is going to be very much implemented by Auckland Council directly, by Auckland Transport, by being really clear about what we're trying to achieve, by the people of Auckland, by agencies such as Waka Kotahi, by the bus companies, it is by schools. It is not something that Auckland Transport or Auckland Council can do on our own.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you both. Deputy Mayor Bill Cashmore.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Kia ora, Adrian, and to your chair, people who are either here in the building or online, and to the staff of AT as well. It's challenging work, but it's been worthwhile work. Excuse my croaky voice. The question I have is the key component to land TERP is going to be that trebling of public transport provision, and I expressed my real personal appreciation for that first and last several kilometres that you're rolling out, have done in Auckland and you're about to do in Pukekohe. So this will be address some of the problems that Linda's gentlemen's are potentially facing. How long will it take to roll out those extra bus services, do you estimate, and how long would it then take to convert the whole fleet to electric? Because that's the ultimate aim.
Mark, I don't want to put you wrong. So I'm going to ask our Chief Executive, Mark, if he would answer those questions.
Thanks, mate.
Kia ora. That is a really difficult question, but probably the critical question. How long have we got and what do we need to do that? To effectively increase public transport usage by 5.5 times in 8 years, that's what we're talking about here, from pre-COVID levels. So before COVID, we were carrying 100 million boardings per annum. And we're currently, literally today, carrying around 60 million boardings per annum. What we need to do here is carry 550 million boardings per annum. So we need to pretty much triple the capacity on the network. To do that, we also need to recruit drivers, purchase buses, and that will need funding. And we need to work through that over the next 6 months through the implementation plan to actually look at the task ahead of us. And then we will work with the council to actually bring that back, and with our other sponsors and funders, central government, to actually present more facts and put them on the table to actually answer that question clearly. So sorry, I can't answer it right now, but we are up against it. Over the last 10 years, we have increased public transport use pre-COVID by around double. It took us 10 years to do that, recasting the network, redesigning the whole network. We're now faced with a triple challenge, and we need to put on the table what it will cost and what it will take to do that.
Thanks, Mark, and I acknowledge the work that you have done and already achieved has been quite outstanding. And the next challenge is not insurmountable. I'm sure it can be achieved with a willingness, a way, and some true leadership. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Good. Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Councillor Bartley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Adrian and Abby and Mark. My question is, do you think we jumped the gun by getting, really focusing in on the electric buses as opposed to making sure our public transport system is reliable, efficient and safe? Or can you have both? Can we achieve both? Because that seems to be the reason why people are turned off catching the buses and the trains, is because they don't come on time,
Yeah.
They stop, like in Onehunga, it stops in Penrose, and you've got to walk the rest of the way at night through industrial area to Onehunga. Do you know what I mean? It's not a viable option for a lot of people.
Yeah, look, I don't think there's any doubt that in doubling and doubling again public transport use in Auckland, we're going to have to be drilling down to a level of understanding as to exactly how the system works in levels of detail we have not currently had. and that includes modes, includes the way that the public transport works. So we've already got a whole lot of tools in our toolkit. I just want to deal with the issue of reliability. I think the council is well aware of the very significant challenges that we're basically facing right now with recruitment, retention, sickness with flu and also COVID. And look, we've explained that pretty well. It's a very unfortunate circumstance. It's being experienced right around New Zealand, and it will get better. And there's a lot of things in place to make it better. Right now, reliability is not where we want it to be, and I know we have to fix that. And some of the fixes is the things that we're doing now, and some of the fixes are going to take more money and a bit more time.
Thank you, Councillor. Look, I've got a number of questions coming up here, but I never prepared the board members or staff for answering questions, and they were coming here to support the Auckland Council presentation on the TERP. So the questions that are to come, we might focus back to the staff on the presentation of the TERP, because some of those questions will be answered through that. And I think just because I don't want to blindside the team here who have come to support our presentation, this is outside standing orders that I got Adrian to speak as co-chair of the TERP, but I think it's best if we move to the presentation, and then if there are questions that come up, we could ask you to come forward. But I think otherwise we're going to get distracted on operational side of things, if that's okay. But just want to thank you all. Thank you. Thank you very much. Right, we'll have Jacques, I think, come first, or the whole team going to come up? Which way? So I will just move the motions on the agenda, and I think the Mayor Goff would like to second. Wrestled Councillor Coombe for the second there. So we'll just move those on the table, but we'll go straight to the presentation. I think Jacques is going to kick off, and then we have Robert and Jenning and Toby to take the main presentation. So Jacques.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Chair, just before I start, I would just like to wish Ning happy birthday today. And I think I also know what the best gift for Ning would be today. And then,
a day off, probably, Jacques.
No, it's not that. Before we start, I would also really like to thank the word TERG has been used. The TERG stands for the Transport Emissions Reference Group. And I really want to thank the reference group for the last many, many months. They have given us very good direction. They have challenged us, the staff, on a whole number of things. They have worked through really boring technical work. They have read many, many reports. And that's kind of through the reference group how we got to where we are today. So I just genuinely want to say thank you very much to the reference group. That really helped us. So, just to get us started, if one believes in climate science, and I appreciate not everybody does, but if one does, you can't help but come to the conclusion that we have very little time left to avoid catastrophic consequences for us as humans. We really can no longer put off taking real and significant action and dealing with the emissions. You also have to come to the conclusion that for Auckland, the most critical thing for us to do is to reduce our transport emissions, and you will see in the presentation why we say that. But transport emissions is the most important thing for Auckland. And that really is what the TERP does. It sets the pathway for what it will take to cut our emissions by 64% by 2030. The chair of the Auckland Transport Board referred to global obligations. So one can argue that, in terms of global emissions, Auckland is so small that it really makes no difference in the scheme of things, and that we should therefore really not inconvenience Aucklanders by reducing our emissions. But think of the implications if every city in the world took that kind of approach, if that is how everybody thought about things. And also think of this. Auckland is the city with the 5th highest per capita transport emissions in the world. Amongst OECD countries, New Zealand has the 5th highest per capita emissions overall. New Zealand contributes around the same global emissions as Azerbaijan and Angola, 2 oil-producing nations. Angola produces around 1.2 million barrels of oil per day, every day. It produces around over 500 million cubic meters of natural gas per day, every day. That is what New Zealand compares to. Same total emissions as Angola. So even though we are small, we make an absolute disproportionate contribution to global emissions. And then you can also think about the nations who produce the least emissions. Tuvalu, Cook Islands, Tonga, Samoa, Vanuatu. Those are our neighbors. And those neighbors are going to be some of the nations on the planet that are going to be the most affected by climate change. So just to put New Zealand's emissions in context. So last year, you asked us to develop a pathway for how we're going to get to the 64% reduction in Auckland's transport emissions. That is what is in front of you today, and I will hand over to my colleagues, and we will take you through the essence of that pathway.
Pressed every button and none of them seem to have much impact. Do you wanna... Oh. Okay, thank you. Which one? Okay, I've pressed every button except for the right one. Okay, well, good morning everyone. Kia ora. My name is Robert Simpson. I'm the manager of the Transport Strategy team. We've been one of a number of teams who have been heavily involved in putting this work together on the transport emissions reduction pathway. So today we're here to seek your adoption of that pathway, and noting, as you've already heard from Chair Young Cooper, that the AT board has already endorsed the TERP last week. Okay, so we will tag team our way through the presentation today. We'll start with some context and then tell you about how we developed the pathway and some of its impacts, and then move on to its implementation. So, the purpose of the TERP. So, apologies, I've missed out a slide there. Not off to a very good start. Sorry, we're missing a slide here, but never mind. So the TERP was not developed in isolation. It was developed in the context of a number of decisions that Council has previously made. So we'll just run through some of them, and apologies, I appear to be missing this slide. So back in 2019, the Council unanimously declared a climate emergency. And at the same time, Central Government passed the Zero Carbon Act. In 2020, Auckland Council unanimously adopted Te Tarakia Tawhiri, Auckland's climate plan. And that same year, Central Government declared a climate emergency itself. Just last year, the Planning Committee directed staff from both Auckland Transport and Auckland Council to develop TERP, which was to set out a pathway to support the scale of emissions reductions in Te Tarakia Tawhiri. And earlier this year, of course, central government released its own emissions reduction plan, and that included a significant emphasis on mode shift to reduce our transport emissions, which is very much in line with where our own pathway is heading. So, in terms of the purpose of the TERP, so as I've mentioned, Te Tāriki Tāwhiri set the ambition for Council, and that ambition is very much in line with the global scientific consensus on what is required if we are to avoid the most catastrophic impacts of climate change. The primary purpose of the TERP is to set out what needs to be true in order to achieve that emissions reduction, the scale of emissions reduction and that ambition. And for transport, that meant a 64% reduction in our emissions by 2030. Of course, this is a massive number. This is a massive challenge, and it quickly became apparent through the work that nothing short of the transformation of the transport system was required if we were to get anywhere near this goal, and also realise the very real and very significant benefits that come along with emissions reduction in terms of improving the well-being of Aucklanders across multiple facets. The second purpose for the TERP was to provide strategic direction for officers as we head into more detailed processes to develop around transport funding and the types of investment that we funded. So the TERP itself was never intended to be a list of specific or detailed projects to reduce transport emissions. There is the elements of that in there, that's right, but it's far broader than that. We have other processes that do that, but as I say, the TERP is far broader. It looks much more fundamentally at the transport planning system. Okay, what are the changes that are required in order to enable us to try and realise the transformation that is needed? And finally, the TERP provides a basis for ongoing partnership with central government. As I've mentioned, the government has passed the Zero Carbon Act. It has its own carbon budgets, and it's recently released its own emissions reduction plan, which has a very strong emphasis on reducing transport emissions, and in particular, encouraging mode shift. We know that there is broad political support for many elements of that plan, and for the Zero Carbon Act, and for the commitment to reducing emissions across the country. So this commitment from central government is likely to be long-standing, irrespective of who is in power for any particular term. So the TERP provides the basis for our partnership with central government. And just as government support for the actions in the TERP is fundamental and is critical, so too Auckland action is fundamental to the government realising its own goals as regards climate action.
Thanks, Rob. So there are many benefits that come with implementing the actions and strategic directions in the TERP. From a global perspective, we achieve our emissions reduction targets and fulfill the climate commitments that we've already made. From a trade perspective, there are many benefits as well. We get access to low carbon markets. We know that businesses are increasingly wanting to invest in green economies, and cities that don't show that they are taking climate action risk losing out. Risk losing their competitive advantage. We also play our role in global and intergenerational equity. As Jacques mentioned earlier, New Zealand has a very small population, but our emissions per capita is one of the highest in the world. From a regional perspective, there are many benefits as well. We create a more equitable region where people of all ages and ability can safely and independently move around to access the opportunities that they need. We start addressing our very poor air and water quality issues, a lot of which comes from transport. We improve our productivity by unlocking the congestion that is estimated to cost businesses around $2 billion a year. With growing population especially, and if we keep on with the car dependency that we have, congestion will only grow. So it is a financially responsible thing to do to give people more choices to move around, and also for goods to move around as well. We also create a more accessible region by reversing the trend of urban sprawl and making neighborhoods more livable. At a personal level, there are also a lot of benefits. We know, for example, that currently pedestrians and cyclists are 10 times more likely to be killed or seriously injured on our roads compared to people traveling by car. So by making our streets safer, the TERP gives people more opportunities to travel around safely and actively, which then improves health, safety, and well-being. And as a result of more people shifting their travel from car to other more sustainable and efficient modes of transport, we also make it easier for people who still continue to need to drive. And ultimately, the TERP provides people with more affordable forms of transport. The AA estimates, for example, that owning and running a car costs around $8,000 a year, and we know that many households own 2 or more cars. The fuel price increase that we're seeing recently is only going to make it worse. So by making sustainable transport options such as walking, cycling, public transport much more accessible, affordable, reliable, and competitive to the car, we give people much more affordable transport options and also increase Auckland's resilience against global shocks like the fuel price increase that we've seen recently. Sorry, that was, don't need that anymore. Cool. There is a climate emergency, and the global scientific evidence is very clear that the only way to avoid the worst impacts of climate change is by rapidly reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. And in Auckland, in Auckland, transport is our biggest source of emissions. As you can see on the graph there, transport makes up over 40% of our emissions in Auckland, and a large chunk of that comes from cars and light commercial vehicles such as utes and vans. But in order to achieve the targets that we've got ahead in front of us, we need to first contend with the 7+ years of transport and land use policies that have prioritized car travel over other sustainable modes of transport, which as a result, we've seen a nearly 90% increase in transport emissions in Auckland over the last 30 years. We have 70% of our transport emissions coming from cars and utes and SUVs. As Jacques mentioned, we have the 5th highest transport emissions per capita in the world. But at the same time, there's a lot of opportunity as well. We know that many of the car trips that are undertaken in Auckland are short. Half of them are under 6 kilometers and 2/3 of them are under 2 kilometers. So while cars will still be an important part of the transport system, there's a lot of opportunity to shift some of these short to medium distance trips to more sustainable forms of transport. As part of the development of the TERP, we spoke to a range of people and groups, including Mana Whenua, local boards, businesses, young people, advocates, and community groups. And they gave us a lot of really helpful feedback about transport. We've distilled that feedback into these 9 themes here. And the first one is something that comes up a lot in our conversations and discussions, which is the need to address the inequities of the current transport system and the high cost of travel that people are currently experiencing. There's been a lot of support for the ambition of Te Tarukia Tawhiri and also support for the TERP to be equally bold and transformational. There's recognition that Auckland Council and Auckland Transport cannot do this on our own, so we need to partner with Māori, with communities, with businesses and government to take climate action. Overwhelmingly, there is support for council and government to prioritize investment in walking, cycling, and public transport. And also at the same time, while there is support for low carbon modes such as e-bikes, public transport, and EVs, there's recognition that a lot of it can be unaffordable to other people, so to provide subsidies to make them more accessible. We've also heard from groups that have personal safety concerns when using the transport system, or have access issues when trying to navigate the transport system, particularly our LGBTQI+ community, disabled people, older people. The TERP addresses that. There is recognition that we need more compact urban forms so that people don't have to travel such long distances, to change and update our engagement processes by partnering with iwi, with Mana Whenua, Mata Waka, community groups, local boards, so that we build momentum for change. And finally, there is recognition that Auckland is very diverse and we can't have a one-size-fits-all approach. we need to tailor solutions and work with communities to ensure that it is fit for purpose.
Kia ora tātou. Through the chair, my role today is to take you through a series of graphs and images that explain the size and the scale of the challenge ahead of us. And once I've laid that out, we'll come back to Ning, who'll take us through the strategic direction to address that challenge. So I'm here to scare us, and then Ning is here to show us how we can use the pathway to reach those goals. So if I could have the next slide. What are we using this one? Oh, fantastic. Maybe I'll just ask you, Kalinda, thank you. So our first slide here, these are two graphs that are showing the same thing. They're just two different ways of looking at our problem. So we have our 64% reduction by 2030 target from Te Tarukia Tāwhiri. And what we were asked to do as a staff working group is take that challenge and answer the question, what is the size of that emissions reduction, and what does the transport system look like when it meets that emissions reduction? So this slide takes us through the size of that challenge, and our later slides explain the characteristics, the shape of the transport system that meets that 64% reduction. On the left-hand side of the slide, you've got a graph showing a BAU line, a baseline, the teal, and a pathway line, the darker blue. The business as usual, the BAU line, is really just a proxy for thinking about the problem. All we do is we take the 2019 per capita emissions and we project those out to 2030. So we're really saying, what if we do nothing and we stay at the same level of emissions per person with population growth until 2030? It's a line to compare ourselves against. The baseline is what is currently in our LTP and what is known about committed government programs. It importantly doesn't include the climate action targeted rate. So our initiatives through that program and the emissions reduction benefit of the program that Aucklanders have voted to support and fund will bring that baseline emissions down further. It's not captured in the modelling here. The pathway line takes us all the way to the 64% reduction. So on the right-hand side, you can see that a little more clearly in the way we've used our blocks. The red block shows the increase associated with population growth and emissions. The sort of green expected changes downward block, that's showing us the proportion of Auckland's regional emissions that might be associated with the programs that we have in train and those that we know from government policy. Then we have the remaining teal transport emissions reduction pathway task. That's the size of the challenge that we face in order to meet the goal articulated in Te Tarukia Tāwhiri. And so our first task there is to identify that challenge, and the second is to describe a transport system that reduces the amount of emissions produced by that amount so that we arrive at our 2030 target, which is that smaller grey block of emissions there on the bottom right. So you can see that it's an enormous task ahead of us, and hopefully that sets the scene for us. If we could have the next slide, please, Kalinda. Thank you. So the next couple of slides, this one's giving us some context. So as Ning mentioned, half of the trips in Auckland are under 6 kilometres. What this graph is showing us is by mode, so each of the colours represents a mode of travel, walking being the big green block that you can see for trips that are sort of in the 0 to 2, 2.5, 3 kilometre distance. And that's showing that the majority of those very short trips in Auckland are already done by walking. And then what you're mostly seeing on this current state, using the 2019 data, is that in Auckland, the vast majority of the rest of those trips by length are done by cars. The bulk of trips in Auckland, over half, are sitting at under 6 kilometres, and that's really important context for the way that the TERP works, because we want to target those trips, since that's where the majority is, and we want to target those that are done by those car and light vehicle trips as their the trips that are adding to our emissions. What's also important to remember is that trips over the 6 and 10 kilometres, right the way out to that sort of 30, 40, 50, 60 kilometres in the graph there, public transport can play a role in converting some of those long light vehicle trips as well. So I've seen a bit of a focus on, you know, half the trips in Auckland are under 6 kilometres and that's the target, absolutely, but there is still some real gains to be made and a real opportunity in converting particularly the centre to centre trips that are the longer distance trips. And that's where we would look for, you know, public transport with priority and thinking about our train and separated bus networks there. So that's how we can address this opportunity. So for context, the slide is explaining we have a bulk of trips here in Auckland sitting under that 6 kilometre mark, and we want to kind of target those. If I could have the next slide, please. So this is just almost the next level down of detail on the previous slide. So on the left-hand side, we have what it looks like now using the 2019 data. And on the right-hand side, we have what's been modelled in the 2030 pathway. So remember, for the 2030 pathway, we've asked ourselves a 64% reduction. What does the transport system look like? And we've modelled the results that you see here. So on the left-hand side, we're seeing with the grey that cars make up the bulk of these distances when we think about trips. So 0 to 2, 2 to 6, 6 to 10, 10 to 20, and those longer trips above 20 kilometres, they're all, apart from those very short trips, they're all primarily done by cars in Auckland at the moment. If we are to create a transport system that achieves that reduction set out in Te Taruki Tāwhiri, then the trip distribution needs to look a lot more like the right-hand side. Okay, so the majority of the trips on the 0 to 2 kilometres are done by walking with some cycling, micromobility, and some public transport. As we start to look at the longer trips, 2 to 6 and 6 to 10, that's where cycling and public transport can play more of a role. And then you can see there in the 10 to 20 kilometres, you can still see, as I mentioned before, public transport doing its part to do those kind of longer trips. But it's also important to acknowledge that TERP is not envisaging a removal of cars from the network, it's envisaging a reduction of cars on the network to make way for the kinds of travel that you're seeing on that graph. So just to draw that out, there's still a fair amount on there that are done, the trips that are conducted by light vehicles. And then perhaps just to note that in the TERP we project a 32% electric vehicle fleet share. So some of that grey block that you're looking at there, that's car travel that is still occurring in 2030, we're projecting an ambitious 32% of that travel, or of the fleet that's making that travel at EV as electric vehicles. If I could have the next slide, please, Kalinda, thank you. Okay, so with all of that context, this is really, this slide and the next, the headline for TERP. So what is TERP really saying? In order to hit a 64% reduction, these are our headlines. On the right-hand side of this slide, left-hand column, you've got 2019. That is our total emissions by mode, and you can see again that big block of blue at the bottom, around 80%, 70-80% of our emissions in 2019 are light vehicles. On the right-hand side of that graph, you can see considerably less emissions overall. That's how we achieve our 64% reduction. And then you can see the makeup of that emissions production by mode. On the left-hand side are our headlines. So really TERP is about halving the travel that Aucklanders do in light vehicles, halving vehicle kilometres travelled, making the most of sustainable modes for those trips under 6 kilometres, converting 32% of the light vehicle fleet to electric, and if we can focus on commercial vehicles that make a lot more trips per car, that's another way that we can bring down those emissions. A 10 times increase in active travel. So each one of these you can see is very high ambition across all modes, and that's the approach that we've taken to the model. And the last one there is that Mark Lambert previously mentioned is the 5 times increase in public transport patronage. But we need to remember that that doesn't translate into a 5 times increase in cost or service provision. We think we can get there from about a 3 times what we have now. And Mark put it really well. We spent the last decade doubling, and it looks like we need to spend the next decade tripling our service provision. I think I just have one more slide, Kalinda. Thank you. Great. So this is a reproduction of one of the, actually most of these have been reproduction of the images we've popped in the final document and members will remember from our workshop. So these are the modelled characteristics of that transport system that achieves a 64% reduction. So a 29% mode share for public transport. That's off about 4% now, so you can really see that high ambition. 13% there for cycling, that's off about a 1% now, so you can see again, incredible ambition behind these numbers to reach that goal. A 3% mode share by walking, that's off about a 1% now. A 50% reduction in vehicle VKT, as I mentioned, light vehicle VKT. A 50% reduction in aviation emissions. A 32% EV fleet share. That's even more ambitious than the government's ERP. Government has us reaching about those numbers in 2035, so we're bringing that forward by about 5 years in order to meet the constraint of the 64% goal. 16% for those new devices, your e-cycles and e-cars. Oh, your microcars. God, they're changing the name on me a lot. A 75% low emissions public transport fleet, a halving of shipping emissions, and about a 45% reduction in road freight emissions. So in each case with the modelling, what we've attempted to do is provide a credible estimate of the change that needs to occur across all elements of the transport system. And in each case, we push them to their plausible maximum. If we look at one of these and think, well, you know, what if we push one a little bit higher? We would need to make a commensurate adjustment across all of those elements within the modelling. And we think we've arrived at a reasonable, high ambition maximum for each of those settings inside the transport system. So that's the size and the shape of the challenge laid out. And TERP isn't all problem. TERP is strategic direction to meet that goal. And so Ning's going to take us through the strategic directions in the TERP that are set out to achieve that. Thank you.
Thanks, Toby. Next slide, please, Kalinda. Cool. So we know that we need nothing short of a complete transformation of our transport and land use system in order to achieve that scale of the challenge that Toby has just clearly articulated. So we have identified 11 transformations that are needed to enable that steep and rapid reduction in transport emissions for Auckland, while also improving Aucklanders' quality of life and well-being. So we've used the government's emissions reduction plan categorization for transport to help ensure alignment between local and central government action. And so you'll see the 3 headlines on top of the green boxes there. So the first category is around reducing our reliance on cars and supporting people to walk, cycle, and use public transport. What this means is making it easier and safer and more attractive for people to walk and cycle and scoot, particularly for those local trips. And this means that we'll need to have much better connected and safer walking and cycling networks and also safer speeds. We also need public transport to be much more competitive against travel by car, so that public transport can be the backbone of our transport system. To do so, we need frequent, reliable, affordable, and accessible public transport that operate at longer hours and go to more places that people want to go to. And to achieve those 2 transformations that I talked about, walking, cycling, and public transport, we need to really look at how we currently prioritize our funding and how we do planning of the transport system, and prioritize the sustainable modes, the modes that we want people to take so that they can be much more attractive and viable. Many of the actions that we are proposing in the TERP to prioritize sustainable transport also means that we can roll out these sustainable transport networks much more quickly and affordably. The fourth one is really around the fact that where it is possible and appropriate, we need Aucklanders to avoid more high emissions forms of transport, such as travel by car, but also by planes, and to either shift to another mode or choose an online option where possible. We also need to use new tools, such as congestion pricing, to make the transport system more efficient. But in doing so, we must ensure that we don't further perpetuate inequities. The next two transformations, 5 and 6, are land use related. So the first one is around creating safe, low traffic neighborhoods so that people can live, play, work locally. And that means increasing the amenity available in neighborhoods across Auckland, calming down local streets so that there is less rat running, and to make them safer. And then the sixth one is around our urban form, ensuring that we build up, not out, so that people can live closer to the things that they need, and that we prevent further urban sprawl. So the second category of transformation areas relate to adopting low-emission vehicles. Cars, as mentioned earlier, will still play a role in our transport system, but we need to make sure that the car trips that are made are as efficient and as low emissions as possible. So that means building on the incentives that the government has already introduced through the Clean Car Program, and looking at things like low-cost EV share schemes that make EVs more affordable to a larger part of the population. But apart from EVs, we also need to look at a more diverse range of low-carbon personal mobility devices, and a lot of them are in the market already, including e-bikes, cargo bikes, e-scooters, e-mopeds, and the like. They are just a lot more efficient and affordable compared to EVs, but with their electric motors, they are also very practical and can start to replace some of the car trips that people are making. The third category is focusing on heavy transport and freight. So this is a growing source of Auckland's emissions and is forecast to grow even more. And what this means is that we need to focus on having low emissions public transport, and there's a lot of work already in this space. Trains are already electric. There's work being done now to electrify the Pukekohe to Papakura link. We've got a commitment to ensure that all new buses are electric and electric ferries are coming on board. So the other thing then is around freight, making sure that freight and service vehicles use cleaner fuels and have the tools that they need to make them more efficient. Things like low emission zones, multimodal freight hubs are some of the things that we could introduce to help, for example, ensuring that the last mile delivery can be done via more smaller, more compact transport modes such as cargo bikes. And a lot of cities are already doing this. Finally, the 11th transformation area, and this is something that was raised by the speaker earlier, is one that underpins all of the transformation areas that we have, because we know that for us to achieve the targets that we have in front of us, we need mindset shifts and we need collective action from all Aucklanders. And that means we need to improve how we currently engage with communities, with mana whenua, with mātā waka. We need to be better at letting people know about the options that are currently available to them and to build support for local action. So the key thing to note about these 11 transformation areas is that this is an integrated package. It's not a pick and mix. Neither is it an exhaustive list of everything that we must do. But what it does is to set the strategic direction for our decision makers to put us on the pathway towards our 2030 target and beyond. It also means that it helps us to prioritize how we plan and fund the transport system and ultimately keep us accountable to the commitments that we've already made. Next slide, please, Glinda. This is my last slide. And the one thing to note about all the actions that we have in the TERP is that they can help to improve equity. We have currently a very inequitable transport system where it is most useful for those with access to a car and a challenge to those who don't. And that means that people, we have a third of Aucklanders who can't drive. And for those who have to rely on public transport, walking and cycling, that means they have to contend with longer, more frustrating journeys sometimes. And sometimes people don't even make the trip. There is not a lot of data around this, but what we do know is that, for example, disabled people, Māori, women, are more likely to miss a GP visit because transport is an issue, because of a lack of transport. So a car-dependent system also means that people are forced to own and operate a car because that's the only way they have to get around, but it ends up costing them a lot. We know, for example, that low-income households spend 28% of their weekly budget on transport compared to 8% for high-income people. So when we rebalance the system, what this means is that we give people more affordable ways of moving around to meet their needs to live a good life. There's a list of the group of people that are most impacted by the inequitable transport system that we have. I won't go through all of them, and you've seen that compelling video earlier about how hard and how hostile it is to for children, young people to navigate the system. What we do have in the TERP are actions that make sustainable transport options more accessible, such as affordable public transport fares, e-bike subsidies, low-cost EV share schemes. There's also other actions such as that help to address people's safety and security concerns when traveling, and ensuring that our public facilities are universally accessible. There are also some actions in the TERP that are critical for us to achieve our target, but require additional mitigation, and that's things like congestion pricing. And we need to ensure that they are staged in a way where we start in areas where choices are already the most abundant, and we make sure that whatever revenue that is generated goes back into improving these sustainable transport modes. So in summary, the current transport system is inequitable, but the actions to lower transport emissions can also help address the inequities.
Next slide. Right, thanks, Nang. So the TERP document sets out actions in three kind of key areas. The first is around both short and medium-term actions to realise the 11 transformation areas that Ning has just taken you through. The second set of actions is around creating a much more supportive transport planning and funding system. And the third are around things that we need to do whilst we're awaiting reform, or whilst we're doing reform, I should say, to integrate TERP into existing processes. Thanks, Glinda. Okay, so immediate and medium-term action. So the TERP document sets out quite a number of actions for each of the 11 transformation areas. They are organised around timeframes, those that we think we can get on with now and in the very near future. We're calling immediate actions, can be taken over the next 2 years. Generally speaking, don't require significant funding increases. These include kind of process changes, regulatory changes, partnership opportunities with central government and stakeholders, things that are all fundamental to enabling the realisation of the pathway. In the medium-term actions, which is years kind of 3 to 5, that's where the majority of the infrastructure and service improvements are, the things that may require additional funding. These can build on the immediate kind of preparatory actions that we're talking about, and there's a range of statutory processes that have been updated over the next 2 years, and we would expect that these investments would be facilitated through those processes. We've also identified out of all those actions a number of key actions, 19 of them I think, that will have especially significant impact, and they're the ones that really must be prioritised, and they cover both short and medium term. Thank you, Glinda. Or Duncan, I should say. As we mentioned, in order to enable the scale and pace of the change required, we need to reform aspects of the current transport planning and funding system, as well as the land use planning system. Now, we don't pretend to have all the answers here. We have set out a number of proposals in the TERP document, but this requires urgent work both within our wider Auckland Council family and also with central government to realise some of the reforms that are needed to enable not just the TERP but also the government's own emissions reduction plan. That is also dependent on reform of the transport planning system. So we've got some broad categories there. I'll go through them just very quickly. So our transport planning process is very complex. Decisions are made and then relitigated at lower levels. Decision-making processes are therefore very slow, and this is something that needs to be streamlined. What funding we do have in the system, the methodologies by which we allocate that funding aren't always necessarily conducive to emissions reductions priorities. And of course, there's no shying away from the fact that more funding is needed. The organisations within the system, and I'm including very much Auckland Council in this as well, we're not necessarily set up to enable transformation. We're all about maintaining the status quo and bringing about incremental change. There are things that we should be doing within each of our agencies to fix that up. And we have some specific proposals in the document, but there's more work needed there, and that work needs to happen urgently as well. There are very real capacity constraints within the sector. Of course, these have been exacerbated by COVID, and Auckland Transport and Waka Kotahi are both facing very real cost pressures and very real funding pressures as well. But it's not just solely related to funding matters as well, of course. There are things like bus driver shortages as well, all of which need to be addressed to enable the type of transformation we're talking about here. Our regulatory framework, many aspects of it date back decades, okay, and they do not reflect the types of changes that are required here. There's been a lot of work going on at central government level around this, and you would have seen the proposals that the Ministry of Transport and Waka Kotahi released last week, which we think will be very helpful in this regard, but still more work is required. And land use as well. Of course, land use planning and transport planning go hand in hand. They're integral to each other. And some of the ways in which we undertake land use planning, both at the central government level and at the local government level, don't necessarily help from an emissions reduction perspective. So we need emissions reduction to be a much more explicit driver of our work in the land use planning processes, as I say, at both central and local government level. And finally, public support. Whilst there's very high public support whenever we ask for it around climate action as a concept, often that doesn't translate into support for specific proposals at the local level. And there's also an issue of vocal minorities having a really significant say on how things are shaped. So there's a lot of work needed to improve our consultation process to ensure that we hear from all voices, not necessarily just the loudest ones. Next slide, please, Kalinda. So there is a significant reform program needed that will take some time. Work is already underway on it. But in the meantime, we will need to implement both the TERP and the government's emissions reduction plan through existing processes. And we've set out some of those key processes there, both the land use and transport track. Many of the elements of these frameworks are up for updating in the next year or so. In fact, indeed, the review of some of these is already underway. So on the land use side, of course, is the MPS on urban development and our own future development strategy, both of which will feed into pending changes on the unitary plan. And as you can see, there's a whole ecosystem of documents and processes on the transport side, okay, which goes to the complexity I was talking about before. These documents are, as I say, are under review as we speak in some instances and will be in the very near future. They all need to reflect the priorities of TERP and the government's emissions reduction program as well. Next slide, please. So we talk about financial impacts and a brief overview here. So there's no avoiding the fact that more funding will be required to bring about the transformation required. But given all the costs that our current transport system imposes on individuals and society in terms of the safety impacts, in terms of opportunities lost through lack of travel choice, in terms of the pollution impacts, and especially, of course, in terms of congestion impacts and the impacts that has on our productivity, as Ning said before, the kinds of changes we're talking about here really are the financially responsible things to do. But as I say, there's no getting away from the fact that more upfront investment will be required. A lot of that investment is accelerating things that are already planned. They might be in decades 2 and 3. We're saying through the TERP that they're required much earlier than that. But the benefits of that start accruing from day one and, of course, compound over time in terms of health, productivity, and equity, and so on. So a real focus of the TERP in terms of financial affordability is making better use of our existing infrastructure. In that way, delivery is both faster and more affordable. And of course, when we talk about bus priority and we talk about reallocating road space to active modes, multiple benefits associated with that, and one of which, of course, is the speed of delivery and the affordability of delivery. So what can be done now? As you've heard from the Chair and CE of Auckland Transport, a lot of things are already being done, but it's a matter of accelerating what we're doing. So Auckland Transport already has work underway, for example, on getting more out of its renewals program, and more work is required also on ensuring that programs like safety deliver on multiple outcomes as well, so making the network safe for all users. So as I say, Auckland Transport already has work underway here, but I should emphasise in singling out these two programs, we're not in any way proposing less be spent on either of them or programs similar to that. It's just about delivering multiple outcomes from them. And as I say, Auckland Transport already has work underway to ensure that renewals in particular can be synced with improvements. New funding sources. Well, as I say, more funding will be required, and we're both government, central government and local government has already stepped up with that. We've of course got our own climate action targeted rate, and the government has recently announced its Climate Emergency Response Fund, the first allocations from which will come early in the new year, and Auckland Transport is currently preparing a submission to apply for a proportion of that funding. But more will, what needs to change, so we can get more bang for buck from our existing funding through the reprioritisation that will go on through upcoming updates to ATAP, RLTP and the local and the long-term plan. And on the government side as well, of course, its own GPS and the activity, and has signalled that the activity classes that around public transport, active modes and so on will receive increased levels of funding. Thanks, Kalinda. So next steps, so you've heard from Auckland Transport that they are currently developing an implementation program around the things that Auckland Transport needs to do to implement the TERP pathway, and of course we'll be providing them with support on that. That program will include a Māori engagement plan, but alongside that, as I said before, there are a number of immediate actions that we can get on with right away. We don't necessarily need to wait for further work to be undertaken. Early next year, we'll be bringing back to you a governance and monitoring framework and also an equity framework, and also starting next year, in fact it's already started, embedding TERP into existing statutory processes as I've previously outlined. There's also one other thing that is missing from there. It's around the government's VKT reduction plans, which Auckland Council and Auckland Transport will be partnering with the government on developing. These will unlock more funding they'll identify the specific things that are required to be done and unlock more funding to support that investment. Thanks, Kalinda. And this, you've already got the recommendations in the report. This is a kind of high-level summary of them. I won't go through them. That's pretty much it for our presentation today. And back to you, Mr. Chair, and open to questions, obviously. Thank you.
Thank you, and you can see the mammoth task you've all had to put this together, so thank you again. Now, I'll just clarify exactly what's going to happen from now. We will go I'm hoping we will finish before we need to go for a lunch break, so we'll have a 10-minute break now, but I do have there were 6 people who asked for questions of AT. So if those 6, I'll have those 6 first, and they can either transfer those questions preferably to the Auckland Council staff, but Adrian is still happy to answer those questions. The reason why I moved those 6, because we would have doubled up and had a lot of information. So go for those 6 first, and if they, then I will get questions after that, then we'll go into the debate. But I think it's important, especially for the staff, to have a 10-minute break now, so we will come back at 11:52, and then we'll get the debate done before lunch. Kia ora.